Walk down any struggling high street in Britain and you will notice something. Between the empty shop fronts and charity shops, there are betting shops. Ladbrokes, Coral, Betfred, William Hill, sometimes 3 or 4 on the same street. Now walk through Hampstead or Bath. The betting shops? Almost gone. This is not random. Research from the University of Bristol found that 21% of gambling premises are in the poorest 10% of areas, compared with just 2% in the wealthiest 10%. That is 10 times more concentrated in places where people can least afford to lose. The question is not why poor people gamble. It is how an entire industry was allowed to cluster in communities already struggling, and what happened when regulation finally caught up. Despite their ubiquity today, betting shops weren't always legal in Britain. For most of the 20th century, cash betting off-course with bookmakers was technically illegal, while betting at racecourses and other on-course venues remained legal, and some off-course credit betting by post or phone operated through legal loopholes. The concern was simple: gambling was considered a vice that needed controlling. That changed with the Betting and Gaming Act, 1960. From May 1st, 1961, betting shops were legally allowed to open. Within the first 6 months, around 10,000 betting shops opened across Britain, according to industry records from the period. It was an explosion of activity. Suddenly, what had been happening illegally on street corners moved into licensed premises. But there were strict controls. The premises had to darken windows and were not allowed to advertise or market themselves. The government's logic was harm reduction. If people were going to gamble anyway, it was better to regulate it than leave it in the shadows. But they wanted to make sure it was not glamorized or made too accessible. Betting shops were meant to be functional, discreet, unremarkable. And for decades, that is broadly how it worked. They existed, but they were not designed to pull everyone in. They served a specific clientele, and they operated in a kind of controlled obscurity. That regulatory framework began to change significantly in the 2000s. The entire philosophy shifted from restriction to liberalisation. The Gambling Act 2005, which came fully into force in September 2007, opened the door for licensed gambling operators to advertise widely on television, radio, and other media. Since 2007, gambling advertising for licensed operators has been permitted across all British media, subject to advertising codes and licence conditions. Suddenly, the old restrictions fell away. Betting shops could have bright shop fronts. They could advertise. They could compete openly for customers. This was not just about betting shops modernising. It represented a fundamental change in how Britain thought about gambling regulation. The emphasis moved from harm prevention to consumer choice. What followed was a transformation. Betting shops were increasingly filled with fixed-odds betting terminals, often called FOBTs, machines that allowed people to gamble on virtual roulette, blackjack, and slots. Fixed-odds betting terminals first appeared in betting shops in 1999 and became widespread after regulatory changes in 2001 that allowed casino-style games. For many years, maximum stakes of up to £100 per spin were allowed until the stake was cut to £2 in April 2019. These were not like traditional fruit machines. On many machines, you could bet £100 every 20 seconds. That is up to £300 per minute. And these machines generated £1.5 billion annually, more than half of all betting shop revenue. They became the entire business model. Profits were concentrated in a handful of shops, but here is the thing: they did not spread unevenly. Glasgow, Liverpool, parts of London and Middlesbrough were among the places affected. Areas with the highest deprivation had one betting shop for every 3,000 to 4,000 people. The wealthiest areas had almost none. The pattern becomes even clearer when you look at the full picture of gambling premises. Around 29% of adult gaming centres were located in the most deprived areas, with bingo venues at 30%, family entertainment centres at 34%, casinos at 24%, and betting shops at 18%. This shows a clear concentration in poorer communities. Think about what this means. In the areas where people have the least money to lose, you find the highest concentration of venues offering gambling products. Meanwhile, in many wealthy areas, these venues are far less common. This creates a paradox worth examining. Wealthy areas have more disposable income and more potential customers with money to spend, yet the industry's physical footprint is disproportionately located in areas where household budgets are already stretched. The economic impact of this pattern is measurable and severe. Public Health England's 2021 review estimated that the harms associated with gambling cost society at least £1.27 billion in 2019 to 2020 in England alone. An updated economic analysis in 2023 estimated that the annual excess direct financial cost to government associated with harmful gambling is about £412.9 million, with a societal value of health impacts equivalent to between £635 million and £1,355.5 million, a combined estimate of roughly £1.05 to £1.77 billion per year. These aren't abstract numbers. They represent healthcare costs, mental health services, and support interventions. They represent lost productivity, financial distress, and pressures on families and communities. And crucially, these costs aren't evenly distributed. The Public Health England review found that people at risk of gambling harms are concentrated in areas of higher deprivation and may already be experiencing greater health inequalities. In other words, the communities that can least afford these costs are the ones bearing them most heavily. By the early 2010s, the situation had reached a critical point. Reports emerged of individuals experiencing severe financial harm. Some coroners' reviews identified cases where gambling-related harm was a contributing factor in mental health crises. Campaigners used stark language, including describing fixed-odds betting terminals as the crack cocaine of gambling. To highlight the issue, though, the phrase became overused. Campaigners pushed for restrictions on fixed-odds betting terminals. The argument was straightforward. If these machines were linked with high-intensity play and concentrated in vulnerable communities, then the stakes needed to be reduced. In response to mounting criticism and government pressure, bookmakers represented by the Association of British Bookmakers introduced and strengthened voluntary player protection tools, including time and money limit options and on-screen alerts, with key measures in place by around 2014 to 2015. But voluntary measures were not enough. The pressure continued to build. Members of Parliament from constituencies with high levels of deprivation spoke about the impact they were seeing firsthand. Local councils attempted to use planning powers to limit new betting shops, but found their options constrained by regulatory principles such as the aim to permit. Eventually, the government acted. On the 17th of May 2018, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport announced that the maximum stake on fixed-odds betting terminals would be lowered from £100 to £2. The reduced stake came into effect on the 1st of April 2019. When the £2 limit came in April 2019, the industry said it would be catastrophic. They were partly right. More than 1,000 betting shops closed in 7 months, 4 per day. William Hill alone shut 700 shops. But here is what is revealing. The shops that closed were not the traditional ones where locals bet on horses. They were the ones open specifically to house-fixed odds betting terminals, shops that existed only because machines could take £100 every 20 seconds. When that revenue disappeared, so did the shops. The areas that had been heavily saturated were suddenly abandoned. The pattern of betting shops in deprived areas is not just the result of organic market behaviour. It is also a reflection of regulatory structures that placed relatively few restrictions on where gambling premises could open. Think about what this means for those high streets. For a decade or more, some areas had multiple betting shops on the same street. Then, when the regulatory environment changed, many of those shops closed, leaving empty units and fewer local jobs. As of the 2024 to 2025 financial year, there were 5,825 betting shops left in Great Britain, down for the 11th consecutive reporting period. It is a pattern seen in other sectors too. Payday lenders, pawnbrokers, rent-to-own shops. These types of businesses tend to cluster in more deprived areas. They often offer products that, in practice, cost more for people with less money, and they have historically operated within regulatory frameworks that develop gradually over time. The question is what we do about it. A gambling white paper was published in April 2023, which concluded there was good evidence that advertising could have a disproportionate impact on people who already had problems with their gambling. Since then, several policy measures have moved forward, including online slot stake limits and the creation of a statutory levy to fund research, prevention, and treatment. This matters because it shows the government recognizes the environment in which gambling occurs plays a significant role. But recognition is not the same as resolution. Implementation of changes is ongoing. The gambling sector continues to participate in consultations and policy discussions, which influences the pace and direction of regulatory reform. Meanwhile, harms continue to accumulate, particularly in the communities already most at risk. The clustering of gambling premises in deprived areas speaks to a broader issue about how we regulate industries with potential for harm. The real debate is how quickly policy should respond to emerging evidence, and how to balance individual freedom with public health considerations. Even now, with fixed odds betting terminals restricted and many betting shops closed, remote gambling has continued to grow. By 2024 to 2025, remote casino, betting and bingo generated £7.8 billion in gross gambling yield, compared with £4.8 billion from land-based gambling. Remote gambling now accounts for around 60% of all gambling revenue, and it has grown more than 60% since 2015 to 2016. The question is whether regulation can keep pace with an industry that has already moved on, because the pattern has not disappeared. It has just moved from high streets to smartphones, from buildings you can see to apps you cannot. Technology changes, the pattern does not. And until regulation catches up, the communities that bore the cost of betting shops will bear the cost of what comes next, just somewhere we cannot see it as easily. For more deep dives into the uniqueness and quirkiness of Britain, subscribe.